So we'll be starting our look at upper invertebrates with mollusks or mollusca. Okay, so there are certain characteristics that mollusks share. Most members are unsegmented with bilateral symmetry. They are soft-bodied animals that come in various shapes and sizes and forms, and we'll talk about what those different shapes and sizes are as we progress through this PowerPoint. They usually have a shell. That shell a lot of times will be external, but sometimes you'll see they'll have an internal shell. And most have an aquatic, free-swimming larval stage, and that larva is known as the trochophore. Make sure you know this term. You will see it again. So as we saw with the annelids, the mollusks have a true coelom that is surrounded by mesoderm. So with all mollusks, regardless of the class that they're in, they have 4 parts to their body. One is a muscular foot. This can take many forms. It can be flat, used for movement. It could be shaped like a spade, used to burrow, or it could be tentacles used to capture prey. The second body part that they'll have is the mantle. It is a thin layer of tissue that covers the body, and the mantle is going to secrete the shell. The third body part is the shell. It's made by glands in the mantle that secrete calcium carbonate to make the shell, and that is the same whether it's an internal or an external shell. And the fourth body part is the visceral mass, and it's just below the mantle, and it's all the internal organs that we've been developing as these critters have evolved. Here we have diagrams of 3 very common mollusks, and they all come from different classes. So what I want to start by pointing out is we've got snails, which are on the land, clams, which are aquatic, and squid that are aquatic. And these are all examples of things that we're going to talk about. So we're going to start by looking at them. This is an early ancestor to them, so you'll notice that it's very similar to the ones that currently exist. So things I want to point out, starting with the foot. So the foot is that muscular part. For the snail, it's this part here, and that's what allows the snail to move. For the clam, you'll see here, it can be used for burrowing into the sand to find things and to hide. And then it's the tentacles for the squid, allowing it to capture food. We also have the shell, and so the shell here is in this brown, and you'll notice the clam, that shell is on the outside, and the shell on the snail is also on the outside. But notice here for that squid, the shell is inside, it's internal, so it doesn't have to be an external shell. Next thing I want to point out is the mantle cavity. So I'm going to use the shade of blue, the mantle. Remember, that's what makes the shell. So we have that here, and then we have it here, and then we have it here. And I'm just pointing out that despite the fact that these have clearly taken very different paths from the perspective of evolution, they still have those same basic parts. And then the visceral mass, they're using digestive tract and gills. These are both portions of those internal organs. Notice we've got the gills here, and we've got the digestive tract here, how that visceral mass is inside. Again, we have organs inside here, so we've got those organs being inside the squid. And again, we have lungs here, and we have digestive tract here. So again, those are those internal organs that are necessary for survival of the mollusk, especially since they're the beginning of the upper invertebrates, so they're more developed and more evolved than what we've seen so far. Okay, so mollusks need to eat. They can be herbivores, they can be carnivores, they can be filter feeders, they can be detritivores, so remember they're feeding off of decaying material, or they can be parasites, although there aren't as many as we saw with worms. One of the adaptations that slugs and snails have is a radula, and what that is a flexible tongue structure that has tiny teeth that are attached to it, and that radula can be used to drill or scrape. So what you're seeing here is if this is the food, as the radula comes over it, see all these little teeth? as it scrapes over it, it's forcing food into the mouth, just like a conveyor belt. See those food pieces ending up inside that? So the radula helps break off pieces of food and move it into the mouth. A big part of the reason why mollusks are considered upper invertebrates is because we're going to start seeing in these upper invertebrates there's more diversity within the phyla than we saw in the lower invertebrates, where there wasn't a whole lot of diversity. So let's talk about some specifics in feeding that's going to address that diversity. So octopi use a sharp jaw to eat. Some of them are going to use poison to subdue their prey and then eat them. Clams and oysters and scallops are going to use filter feeding, where they use feathery gills, and we'll see that when we dissect a clam. Over the gills, you're going to see plankton getting trapped in this, and then there's cilia that will move the trapped plankton to the mouth. And then there's a siphon, and this siphon will bring the water in, and then there's an excurrent siphon that will take the water out. So it's a tube structure in which water comes in for filter feeders. It brings the water over the gills, so it exchanges gases, and it also, the cilia are there to trap the food, and then the water exits through the excurrent siphon. And we're going to see that siphon again because squid and octopi have the siphon, but they use it for a very different purpose that's not involved in feeding. All right, so let's talk about gas exchange, respiration. Aquatic mollusks typically breathe using gills that are found inside the mantle. They're part of that visceral body mass. As water passes over the gills, oxygen diffuses in and carbon dioxide diffuses out, and this takes place between the blood and the water. On the land, we have snails and slugs, and they don't have gills. Instead, their mantle has a large surface area that's lined with blood vessels, and the mantle has to stay moist for diffusion to take place. Therefore, they tend to live in moist areas. This is also why you don't kill a slug with a lot of salt, because that will hurt the slug for a lot of different reasons, but it will paralyze their ability to diffuse oxygen in, and therefore they suffocate, which is a terrible way to die. So mollusks can either have an open circulatory system or a closed circulatory system, and a vast majority of them have open circulatory systems. This is where blood is pumped through vessels by a simple heart. The blood eventually leaves the vessels and goes into these big sinuses. They're these large sac-like places. And this is where gas exchange can occur between the cells, and then that blood will go back to the gills to get more gas. And there's a lot of mixing between oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, and so it's not very efficient. And this is why it works really well for slow-moving mollusks. However, if the mollusk moves fast, it must have a closed circulatory system, and this is because it transports blood through the body quicker to keep up with the oxygen demand for moving quickly. Okay, so mollusks get rid of their nitrogen waste using nephridia, and nephridia filters the blood to get the waste, the nitrogen waste out, and then it releases that waste out of the body. And this is what kidneys do. So this is the primitive kidney that we have been waiting for. And we're starting to see the start of the idea of making urine by filtering blood. Since there's a large diversity within the organisms in mollusks, there's also going to be a large diversity within the nervous systems that they possess. So the complexity of their nervous system is going to vary greatly. There are some that have a very simple nervous system that includes a small ganglia that's typically found near the mouth. It has a few nerve cords and some simple sense organs. However, this ranges all the way up to very complex nervous systems with well-developed brains and very highly developed nervous systems for all of invertebrates, even the ones that are more well-developed. And we'll see that when we take a look at the eye of the squid. That's a very highly developed sense organ. So most of these organisms have to move. Snails are going to secrete a mucus along the base of the foot, and then they're going to create a rippling motion with the foot to move over the mucus, to kind of slide over it. Think of like a slip and slide. Ew. And then octopus octopi use a very different form because they're going to use jet propulsion. So what they're going to do is they're going to draw water up into the mantle cavity, and then remember that siphon that we talked about for feeding with clams. Now octopi have a siphon that leads out, so they're going to force the water out the siphon, and that's going to propel the octopus in the complete opposite direction. So not to get all crude drawing on you, but if this is the octopus and you've got tentacles coming down here, tentacles, oh, you know you like my drawings. And so we're going to trace the water, and I'm going to make it purple since the slide's blue. The water comes up into the mantle, and then it has a structure, the siphon. It's this little tube with a hole coming out. If the water comes down through that and out with great force and pressure, it's like when you let go of a balloon, it's going to shoot that octopus off in the opposite direction from which the water is being forced out of it. Okay, so reproduction of simple mollusks, they use sexual reproduction with external fertilization. They're going to release a ton of eggs and a ton of sperm into the water. They're going to hope some of them meet up somewhere in the water, and that's going to produce that free-swimming larva, which, remember, is called a trochophore. Mollusks that have tentacles and some snails, the fertilization will take place inside the body of the female, and we still have some hermaphrodites hanging on, so it's not completely single sex at this point. Okay, so we've talked about snails, and we've talked about octopi, and we've talked about clams. Well, they all fall into three different classes of mollusks. So we have the gastropods, and gastropods are the snails and slugs. We have the bivalves, which are your clams and oysters, and then we have the cephalopods, which are your squid and octopi. So let's take a look at each one of those individually. So with the gastropods, this is going to include pond snails and slugs and sea butterflies and sea hares and limpets and nudibranchs. They are shell-less, or they have a single shell that's external. They move using their muscular foot, which is located on the ventral side of the organism. They can get completely inside the shell if they need to for protection, and those without shells can hide. They can squirt ink into the water as a smokescreen, or they can secrete chemicals that taste bad or are poisonous so that other organisms don't try to eat them. Next up are the bivalves. These are clams, oysters, mussels, scallops. They have two shells, hence the prefix bi, two. The two shells are held together by either one or two muscles. They typically stay in one place, and currents created by the cilia on the gills circulate water throughout the body cavity and allow for filter feeding. Once the water's inside the body, filter feeding, they use mucus and cilia in their gills to trap the food particles in the water and then move it to their mouth. And finally, we have cephalopods. These are your octopi, squid, cuttlefish, and nautiluses. They are soft-bodied. Their shell is either going to be internal or they don't have one. The head is attached to a single foot. That foot can then be divided into tentacles or arms. Typically, you're going to see 8 or more tentacles equipped with sucking discs that allow them to grab and hold on to the prey. And most modern cephalopods have either a small shell that's internal or no shell at all. So cephalopods have numerous complex sense organisms that help them detect external stimuli and then allow them to respond to it. They can distinguish between shapes by sight and by texture of touch. The eyes of many cephalopods are as complex as several vertebrates. The eyes can be large. Some are going to be the size of like a dinner plate in some species of octopi, and they can distinguish objects as small as a ½ centimeter from a meter away, which is better than I can see, and that allows squids to locate a wide variety of prey to eat. Though cephalopods' eyes may look like a vertebrate eye from the outside, the internal structure is quite different. So we're not quite to the ability, while their eyes have the ability to see and sense very small differences, the shape of their eye, the structures of their eye are very different. And so we'll see that continue to evolve as we move up the chain. Last but not least, we need to talk about why study mollusks. They are great environmental monitors. What that means is they filter feed, especially the bivalves, and so they concentrate very dangerous pollutants in the water and microorganisms in their tissues. So we can monitor the water quality based on what we're finding in the mollusks. Um, Obviously, we use mollusks for food. We eat oysters, clams, mussels, squids, scallops, snails, and so forth. We can use their shells for fertilizer. So after we eat oysters and clams, we can grind up their shells and use them as a fertilizer. Some people like to collect seashells, and then obviously oysters and clams sometimes will produce pearls, and we use that to make jewelry. I hope you enjoyed learning about mollusks, and now we got some classwork to go with it.